Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, How to Build a Financial Plan Investors Will Love. My name is Teresa, and I am here on behalf of the marketing team at Early Growth. So thank you so much for joining us. If you're not familiar with Early Growth, we have been around for over 10 years. We've worked with a lot of startups, early stage companies, helping them get on track with their accounting. We offer several services, including our amazing and experienced seasoned CFO services, taxes, valuations, fund accounting, and administration. If you, again, are not familiar, please check us out on our website at earlygrowthfinancialservices.com. Feel free to email us, let us know how we can help you, and we will be happy to set you up with someone in our department. Here are just a few companies that we have worked with, and a wonderful quote from our founder and CEO. Startups face a huge burden in today's economy and often have to choose between funneling resources towards creating their goods and services or managing the often complex accounting, tax, and financial strategy planning necessary to run a small business, which is where we come in. We love to help early stage companies so they don't have to choose between improving their product or service and having experienced expert financial guidance managed by an expert. We have another quote by Guy Kawasaki. The point of financial projections is to tell a story with numbers. You can take your time reading the rest of this. This will be available for you in the next 48 hours. But this is pretty much why we decided to do this webinar, so that you can understand how to tell a story with your numbers. Our presenters today are two of our amazing consulting CFOs. They've been with us for a very long time. They've worked with so many companies, and you are in great hands. Ala and Sirk, I'm going to let them tell you a little bit more about themselves. Ala?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name is Ala Ismail. I've been with Early Growth for a little over 10 years. I have a fairly extensive experience as a consultant, and prior to that, I had public accounting experience as well as practical operational experience as controller and CFO at startup companies. The industries that I primarily focus on are SaaS, e-commerce, but I also have some hardware and service type companies as well. Have worked with a lot of companies that have had very, very successful exits from successful acquisitions to IPOs. Thank you very much again for attending.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sirk Rowe, and I'm also a consulting CFO with Early Growth. I have been with the firm for a little over 6.5 years, and like Ala, have worked with lots of different companies in different industries. SaaS obviously is a big industry right now, and I work with several SaaS companies. I work with a couple of hardware companies. I do a little bit of nonprofit work. Have a couple of nonprofit clients as well. And I thank you all very, very much for taking your time to spend an hour with us.
Thank you so much. Again, if anyone missed the beginning, this will be available to everyone who registered today. A link will be sent to you. You can also find this on our YouTube page for Early Growth. And I think that's it. Oh yeah, and if you have any questions, feel free to just drop your questions in the Q&A. We will answer those questions either within the presentation or right after.
Great, so let's get started. So we'll talk a little bit, as Teresa mentioned, this is a presentation on the kind of the beginning stages of effort of building a financial plan, right? And you use financial plans for lots of different things, from operational planning and managing. But in this particular case, we're going to be focusing a little bit more on building a financial plan that is going to look good to investors as you go out to talk with them. So this isn't, this is probably meant more for companies that are looking for external financing at some point, not necessarily maybe a mom and pop shop that's looking for kind of like an operational plan to make sure that they're able to, keep expenses below revenue. So this is more about like long-term planning for a company that ultimately is going to go out to outside investors. And so let's just kind of start off with, the different approaches that you can take and kind of, some do's and don'ts related to both top-down and bottoms of financial projections, because you hear those terms. And for the most part, both Ala and I, as well as any, experienced CFO will tell you that the more detailed that you can have, the more historical data, the more market data that you can bring to bear upon putting together a financial plan, the better off we are, right? And so, when we look at a top-down financial projections, there's two types, and we want to touch upon the one that you kind of want to start with to get at a potential revenue plan, and then I'll also touch upon one type of top-down financial planning that you don't want to be doing. And so when we talk about the kind of top-down financial projections that we should be using, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get an idea at a really early stage for a company that is kind of just starting out, of trying to figure out what kind of revenue potential that we have. Right. And so, so clearly, if we have historical data, if we already have some revenue streams and we know kind of what it takes to get to that revenue, then we obviously use that. But for companies that are kind of in initial stages of product development, they haven't gone out to the marketplace yet. They are really trying to figure out what their financials might look like in the future. Then obviously we don't have that luxury. And so we're having to kind of build a plan using some assumptions. And the way that we go about doing that is we really kind of do this tops down funnel type of approach, where we start with a total market size, and then we kind of start whittling that market size down based upon kind of our product or service, our geographic location, all the factors that bring to bear on, what might impact revenue, to kind of get to a potential revenue stream. Right. And so we talk about acronyms like TAM, which is total available market, and SAM, which is serviceable available market, and then SOM, SOM, serviceable obtainable market. And so all what those really are, it really says we start with a big market, the entire market size of kind of our offering, and then we start whittling that down. And we may whittle that down by a particular vertical segment that we're going after. We might whittle that down by geographic locations. We might whittle that down by special industries, right? Or even, niche industries that we're really going after to start off with. Because, clearly when we're at an early stage of the company, we're not trying to take a big bite out of the entire market. We start off by going after a smaller part of the market, gaining a foothold, learning from that experience, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and then expanding upon that. And so to the extent that we can do that, and to the extent that we can really identify particular segments of the market that we're going after, and then say, okay, well, based upon what we know about our market size, our market opportunity, what we know about what current players in the space are doing, what our competitors are looking like, what are we bringing to bear on the problem that we're trying to solve, what's the secret sauce that we have. All of those things should kind of help determine like what kind of revenue potential, what percentage of that market that we're going after are we going to actually be able to win. And so you kind of use that to kind of come up with over time, what we think our potential revenue is going to be. The type of top-down financial projection you don't want to be using is where you basically just say, okay, well, I think we're going to be able to, produce revenue of this amount, maybe, $5 million by the end of next year, and not that we have any reasoning for it, but we just think we can get there. And then, oh, by the way, we want to, make sure that 30% of that revenue is going towards cost of goods sold, and 20% of that is going to R&D, and 20% is going to marketing sales and marketing and so on and so forth. And here's where we come down in terms of the bottom line when it comes to net income. And so we want to be really, really careful about using those kinds of top-down financial projections. Rather, we want to use the top-down financial projections to kind of at least get to our revenue potential.
That's a very good point, sir, because very often I see entrepreneurs use TAM numbers that are completely unrealistic, determining the total size of their market based on some kind of demographic in the entire country of China, for example, where they don't really, it's not really a practical example for their business model. So granted, this is a top-down revenue projection, but have some thought behind it. The more thought that you give it, and the more credible that your revenue story is going to be.
That's right. That's right. Thanks, Ala. Let's go to the next slide, Teresa. So, and then once we have that kind of, at least a high level, revenue stream that we're trying to project out to, that we are trying to reach, then, now we start really talking about bottoms up financial projections. And using bottoms up financial projections is the way that both Ala and I would recommend, basically everyone to try to at least approach financial models this way, understanding that sometimes we don't have all the data to be able to do it. But the more thought that you can put behind this kind of a modeling effort, the more you're going to understand kind of what the drivers are, as well as, and most importantly, as we kind of talk about, potential investors, the more confidence that you're going to, that the investors are going to have with your understanding of the company, the industry that you're going after, the potential, the market potential, and what it's going to take to get there. And ultimately, with investors, it's about earning their trust, right? And so this is going to go a long ways towards that. And what we really mean by this is we want to kind of start with this revenue projection that we're expecting over whatever period you want to say. We typically look out 3 years in terms of financial planning, and then what we do is we now start doing a bottoms-up approach towards how do we get to that revenue stream, right? What kind of spending do we have to expend in terms of product development? What further level of effort is there to complete the product, or to at least get the feature set that we need to be able to attack the marketplace to start? What kind of people do we need in order to make that happen? When do these people need to be on board? What other kind of spending do we need to incur? Are there hardware? Do we need to purchase servers and other capital equipment? Is it more service related? But really, the key is to think about what resources we really need in order to get to those revenue projections. And Ala is going to touch upon this in more greater detail, but we're really going to be talking a little bit about milestone funding later on, and that's a key part of doing these financial plans from a bottoms-up perspective. But think about what kind of headcount is going to be needed to be able to reach some of those milestones that we need to hit. And how that kind of dovetails into the financial plan that we're putting together, as well as potential investment that we're looking for from external. Ala, do you want to add anything to that?
Nope, I think that one. I'll feel free to chime in whatever you. But you typically address things very perfectly, so that you covered everything.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ala. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. And so, before we even get into kind of the details of, some of the line items that we want to be budgeting for or planning for, let's just think about some higher level stuff, right? And a couple of these, regarding company buy-in is really, really critical, right? Because as founders, we obviously have an idea of what we want to have happen with a company. Ultimately, a lot of the decision making is on us. But for a company to be successful, we really need to have buy-in, right, from all the stakeholders. And if you've got a co-founder, if you've already kind of started to build out an executive team, then getting their buy-in, as you put together a financial plan is really, really critical, right? Because if you put together a financial plan that says we're going to hit these kinds of revenue targets, and your CRO or chief revenue officer or your VP of sales basically is saying, I don't see how we're going to be able to get there. It's going to take longer than you think to get us to that revenue, and they don't really buy in, then that's obviously already a recipe for disaster. Similar to R&D, right? If you have, if you are assuming product development to hit certain milestones, within a certain amount of time, and the VP of engineer or CTO is basically saying that we can't do that unless we hire, 40 engineers, then obviously that's going to have an issue as well. So the idea is to make sure that we have agreement from the leadership team, that you understand that everyone around the table understands what the key objectives are, and then to the extent that there are any milestones that you have to hit along the way, what those milestones are, and when do we need to reach those milestones for the company to be successful. And if you at least start with that, those three things, then I think you're already off to a good start in terms of putting together a financial plan. Yeah, go ahead, Ala. I think you wanted to say something.
So I think the question that I always get back when we talk about company buy-in, especially from entrepreneurs, is saying, look, I have the vision. I know where this company needs to go. Why do I need to, get everybody's buy-in? I'm the one that has a vision. I'm the one that is my reputation on the line. That's true. I mean, a successful entrepreneur has to have vision, has to have creativity, and a lot of times an entrepreneur, somebody who's starting a company, sees things that other people do not see. I still think that this exercise is incredibly useful, just because your ability to convince your own team and to entertain their input really is a key to your success as an entrepreneur. Very few companies out there that are just driven by their founder or CEO, and it's their way or the highway, maybe with the exception of Facebook and Apple, but those are rare and really typically lead to unsuccessful results. Because at the end of the day, if you're presenting to an investment team, they will feel if your team is lockstep, and everybody's kind of pulling on the rope at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ala. Okay, let's move forward. Okay, so we talked a little bit about revenue, but this is kind of where financial plans start, right? So it's figuring out what we are going to be able to do in terms of revenue, and so some of the things that we've seen entrepreneurs do is using kind of like wholesale assumptions. Like, for example, they say, okay, well, there's no reason why I can't, increase revenue by, 10% a month, for the next, 18 months. And then after that, maybe it drops down to 7% or 5%, using those types of, kind of like, I guess, assumptions without really any logical reasoning behind it. And so we obviously encourage you not to be doing things like that. We really encourage you to understand kind of what those revenue drivers are, right? And every different company, every industry, they have different types of revenue drivers. Some of it may be, literally about advertising dollars that you spend. It may literally be about being able to say that, hey, listen, it's about the number of salespeople we have and how many, revenue dollars per salesperson we're able to bring in. So depending on, what you understand the drivers to be, those are the drivers that we should be using, and those are the assumptions that we should be using to kind of, put together a revenue plan that makes sense. And ultimately, this is a number that is going to drive so much of the business, and your confidence level in being able to either to meet those numbers, and maybe in particular at the beginning of this process, being able to defend those numbers, right? Being able to say, hey, here are the reasons why we think that we can hit these revenue numbers. Being able to explain that to potential investors is going to be, again, the key to earning their trust and their confidence, and that's kind of what we're trying to do. Okay, and then after that, right? Obviously, it comes down to spend, because if we really think about kind of the totality of the financial plan, really, and again, putting this in context of, you know, this is putting together a financial plan for, you know, potential investment from the outside. What we're really saying is, look, we've got this revenue opportunity out there that over time is going to be big. We're going to be successful in hitting these revenue targets. And so over time, we're going to become a very, very successful company. We're going to be profitable. And you as shareholders are going to reap the benefits of that, as well as obviously the founders and the employees and every other stakeholder in the company. But obviously this requires an investment, right? And so this is why you're getting investment from the outside. You're going to be going through a period where you're going to be spending more money than you're going to be earning. You're going to be burning cash, and that's kind of, as you're burning cash, you're building up value in terms of, the product development, maybe some IP, obviously some customer attractions, all of those things that create value in the company. You're doing that, and you're spending money to do that. And so the expectation is that we are going to be burning money, while we build up the company. And so but understanding where that spend is, the value of the spend, of every dollar that we spend, and how that contributes to creating value for the company, that's really kind of what this is about, right? And so, when we talk about spending, we look at that revenue targets, we look at the milestones that we're trying to achieve with this next round of financing, and we say, these are the resources that we need. This is the money that we have to spend in order for us to hit those goals, right? And so if we kind of think about the expense structure and the spending in that light, then I think we're again on our way to at least building a plan that makes sense from all different angles. And so what resources? Headcount is obviously going to be the biggest one for most companies. Unless you're a company that is like a reseller of goods, for example, where things like inventory is going to be a big part of our business. For many of our clients and a lot of early stage tech companies that are going to be more inclined to raise money from outside, we're talking about headcount as being kind of the biggest expense, right? And so who do we need to hire? What levels? What time frame? Obviously, if you wait until the absolute need is there and we need to have sales and now we need to hire 3 or 4 salespeople, that's not the right approach. You need to be planning for an advance. But at the same time, you don't want to hire people in advance of when we really need them, thereby obviously incurring expenses that may not provide the best value for us long term. So kind of think about staffing. First and foremost, that's going to be the biggest driver. Then the next couple of line items here, professional services and consultants, those also tend to be, more on the expensive side and obviously are drivers of expenses as well. So think about, where you can and should be using outside services. Obviously, at an early stage, you're not going to be hiring lawyers internally. And so you're going to be using, people like outside law firms, right? Similar. And one of the reasons why early growth is so successful is because a lot of early stage companies don't need to be hiring accounting people internally. And so, they'll use outsourced services like that. HR consultants or HR services, payroll services, things that you don't necessarily want to be doing internally. These are the things you kind of want to be planning for and making sure that we've got line items in our spend plan to account for those. And then, depending on the kind of company, marketing may be a huge part of it. Obviously, marketing expenses increase over over time, as we get bigger and bigger and bigger, and we go after more and more revenue, marketing spend typically should turn into a good investment in terms of generating marketing dollar spend into revenue dollars. And so, make sure that we're planning for that properly. And then other things like, travel and entertainment, office leases, office expenses, all of those things, obviously you want to take into account. But as we'll talk about in the next couple of slides, I think you'll find that, just several main assumptions will kind of drive a lot of the spending planning. Okay, and some methodology, in terms of how to go about actually doing it, the technicality of it. Obviously there are services out there. There are software services that you can take to assist with budgeting. But for most part, most of our early stage companies, clients use spreadsheets, right? And so whether you're an Excel person or a Google spreadsheet person, using spreadsheets as a place to generate the model for the financial plan and the budget is what we typically recommend. To the extent that you'll want to kind of set up the model so that you have different tabs for different things. Obviously, some of the bottoms up assumptions that we use to create the revenue worksheet is going to be critical, so that you can kind of understand and play around with some of the factors to see what happens as you make some changes to assumptions. If you have a big enough department, if you have a big enough company where you have different departments, let each one of them kind of develop their own spending and spending tab. But I kind of think that for early stage companies, you're probably not going to be using this. It's going to be typically you as the founder, maybe a co-founder working on it and kind of doing a planning for the entire organization. And then, this last bullet point is really, really critical, and I think really is going to help you to really understand the drivers of the financial model, which is, set up a worksheet with just the key assumptions. I think you'll find, and I'll ask Ala to pitch in on this as well, but I think you'll find that most financial models are really driven, like 80 to 90% of the accuracy of a model is probably driven by, a handful, 5, 7, 8 key assumptions. Everything else is kind of noise beyond that. So it's kind of that, like that, we like to say that, it takes 10% of the effort to get 90% accuracy, and then it takes 90% of the effort to get the last 10% of accuracy. And this is probably that same thing, where if you kind of spend the bulk of your time on some 5 to 7 to 8 key assumptions, that is really going to drive the bulk of the model. And so really think about what are those key assumptions? What are the drivers that we can kind of play around with? And as we make changes to those assumptions, what happens to the model? If you build out a model that way, then I think it'll prove well for you, not only from understanding the financials, but also doing some a lot of ad hoc analyses, which you'll probably need to do as you get more and more involved, and as investors start asking questions.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, sir. It's not just for the creation of the model that a working key assumption sheet is important. That I think that helps in the detail and helps you get through a lot of scenarios. So in creating the model, it's certainly useful. It's also useful when you are presenting to a potential investor or any third party. You'll find that there won't be enough time to get into the minutia of your model. So having something very clear that somebody reviewing your model that kind of guides them through the key assumptions that were used, you'll find that very, very helpful, and the reader of your model or your pitch deck will find that a lot more useful, and you could avoid a lot of questions later on.
Yeah, and it really also just touches upon your being able to communicate to potential investors your understanding, right, of the major things that are going to drive the success of your company, and having that be very, very high level is going to be easier for you to be able to defend. It's going to be easier for you to be able to for outside investors to understand as well.
So there was a question, Cirque, about examples of key assumptions.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So actually, I think the next slide, there's we touch upon that. So let's go to that. So here's just a slide on some key assumptions. Like I said, it all depends, right, on what kind of company you have. It's really dependent on the founder, who obviously understands the business or the business opportunity better than anyone else to really understand what those drivers are. But here are some of them, right? Obviously, from an expense standpoint, the rate of hiring, the people we're hiring, when we're hiring them, how quickly we want to increase our workforce is a huge assumption in terms of what happens with our spending and how long the cash that we have or that we're looking to raise is going to last us. Right, things like, it may be like, as I mentioned previously, we may have the kind of business where literally it's a high touch sales model. A salesperson has to be involved in every single deal, and therefore ability to hire sales people and have them be, and have them own a certain revenue per salesperson might be a big factor and one of the key assumptions. For companies that are in the SaaS space, and maybe Ala can speak a little bit more to SaaS companies because he's such an expert in it. But things like customer lifetime values, annual recurring revenue, churn, average revenue per customer per year, for example. Those kinds of things have a really, really big impact, because that obviously then dives into, okay, in order to get to our revenue stream, how many new customers do we need to sign up if we assume customer lifetime values and churns and average deal sizes, for example. And does that make sense compared to, our revenue stream goals, as well as some of the other, hiring plans, for example? Does all that pull together in a cohesive manner? Those are the kinds of things that you're going to be looking for. It's really, really hard to just identify and say for everyone that, these are the 5 things. I can obviously tell you that rate of hiring is going to be critical for every company. But for some of the other kind of the key assumptions, a lot of it really depends on your individual company, the industry you're going after, and the stage of the company that you're in. Ala?
Yeah, I think in not just SaaS, but in e-commerce, especially when you're talking about revenue, there's a lot of things that kind of investors are looking at around that, around these assumptions. So, for example, if you're a SaaS company, how are you going to go to market? Are you purely depending on a digital kind of a presence where you're marketing yourself through various either social media or Google or whatever the digital marketing approach that you're taking? They're going to want to know really what are the assumptions behind that. Like, what do you anticipate your success rates at the beginning, in the middle, at the end of certain campaigns? Or if you're a direct sales approach, how many folks are you going to hire, and what kind of people are you going to hire? That kind of general information in the assumption sheet is really critical, because it informs your model. The worst thing that you can do is just put in a revenue number and various operating cost numbers without any context. If you put in some of the underlying assumptions, you could have discussions around that, and the reader could have a better understanding of where you're going with the company, because a direct sales force might be more expensive. Some digital marketing programs are hugely expensive.
Yeah.
So those kind of things will guide conversation from the beginning, as opposed to just showing a bunch of numbers on a P&L.
Yeah, excellent points. Okay, and then this is the last slide before I kind of turn it over to Ala. Some other things that we want to kind of consider as we're putting together a financial plan. We've already kind of talked about some of the key variables and some of the revenue assumptions. Definitely spend some time on that, and then kind of what the buildup of the expense model and the headcount planning model looks like underneath that, right? And then in addition to that, what we highly recommend from a modeling perspective is run different scenarios, right? So we love putting together plans where we have an expected case scenario, a best case scenario, and a worst case scenario, right? And those obviously come with different types of assumptions. If you want a dynamic model that allows you to kind of play around with those and toggle things back and forth to see what things are looking like, that's obviously a great approach if you have the wherewithal and the thinking to be able to do that. We highly recommend that. We highly recommend that for a couple of different reasons, right? Because what that means is that we need to be flexible, right? Especially at early stage, we don't know what we're going to all run into. We're gonna pivot. I guarantee you, as a founder of an early stage company, you're gonna have pivots along the way, right? Meaning that you learn something as you go along. Either the market moves away from you or moves in a different direction. We're not as successful as we expect to be in terms of selling, and we need to put more resources behind it. Product development maybe falls behind, and all of those impact our plan. And we need to always be ready to not only understand what happened, but then what does that mean going forward. And so putting together a model that is able to run different scenarios gives us the tools to be able to look at that quickly, right? And make and analyze the numbers quickly and make decisions quickly. And as a founder of an early stage company, being able to make pivots quickly, make decisions, and move the direction of the company quickly is one of the key advantages that you have over a bigger company, right? And so, being able to take advantage of that is and being able to run different scenarios so that you can take advantage of that benefit is going to help you a lot. And then, in terms of people ask, well, how long do we plan for? And, unless you have a long history and you're really looking at like long-term planning, 5 years down the line, we encourage 3-year plans at most. And the reason for that is because that's really a good timeline in terms of you're going to have some huge milestones along the way. And if you're raising money today, you're going to be raising money probably that'll take you maybe 18 to 24 months, right? You're not going to be raising in your first round of financing or even your second round of financing. You're not going to be raising enough funds to be able to get you, past 3 years plus, unless of course you're just blowing it out and you're able to generate positive cash flow on your own. But in terms of actual investment, you're looking at probably a 18 to 24 month horizon. And so to the extent that you can put together a 3-year plan that shows what's going to happen with the money that we're raising over the next 18 to 24 months, what are the milestones that we're going to hit, and then, oh, by the way, here's another year and a half worth of financials of what it looks like, assuming that we're going to be successful with our initiatives. That again is going to then allow investors to be able to see see what the future looks like in terms of what the numbers are showing, and hopefully what the numbers will show is that the investment they're making today is going to turn into a much greater value into the company 18 months from now when you go to raise that next round of financing, and it's going to happen at a greater valuation, and the value of the shares that they're purchasing today is going to be worth more in 18 to 24 months. So, putting together a financial plan for 5 years out doesn't really add a lot of value to that.
A lot of times I have clients that either are engaging possible investors, or if they're in an M&A situation, or having an investment banker ask for 5-year projections or insist on 5-year projections. I always, whenever that happens, my senses go up, because especially in the startup environment, a 5-year plan to me as an investor would be meaningless. Really what I would be focused on, as Cirque said, is in the 18 to 24 month time frame. In a startup company, knowing what's going to happen 5 years down the line and have that affect any kind of investment decision is is bordering on ridiculous.
Yeah.
When you have a potential investor insist or ask for 5-year numbers, you should look at it with a little bit of critical eye.
Yep. Yep. And so with that, I think we're going to also now spend a little bit of time on actually prepping for fundraising, and for that, I'll let Ala take over, so you don't have to listen to my droning voice anymore.
Thanks, Sir. That was awesome. Once you've kind of the reason why we go through the budgeting first, because number one, we're a bunch. So I'm sorry for that. I was on mute. The reason why we go through the budgeting first is that we are accountants, and to the old adage, to a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. But I think it's really important to understand your roadmap before you get into kind of the fundraising nitty gritty. And I think a really good forecasting approach or a planning approach gives you the roadmap that will end up with a really, really effective pitch deck and will really focus your fundraising efforts. So one of the things that we really stress to a lot of our clients is go through a milestone fundraising process. There are a lot of reasons why that's the best approach. Number one is that you tend to not give away too much of your company, either overraise or underraise. I think a lot of seasoned investors right now do not go in and fund a company from startup to IPO in one go. So by you kind of understanding what those milestones are and approaching investors with the proper message will make you a lot more credible. It will save on dilution and also allow you to be able to pivot, as you probably will, like as Cirque mentioned. Number two is the different milestones that you create will add value to your company. You'll go through different market conditions at different times. So your company maybe have a certain value at the pre-product stage, and once you develop your product, your valuation will increase by some kind of factor, and then once you get some kind of traction in revenue and with customers, your valuation is gonna change, and the market is gonna change. So that milestone fundraising approach is really what we advocate. So what are kind of the goals that those milestones should be? Well, it really depends on where you're, what market that you're in. If you're a pure SaaS company or not a SaaS company, if you're a SaaS company that you're going to put a product out on the internet, and for folks to start playing with having a product ready to go live is a key milestone. A lot of companies that are product development may not have the best success in fundraising if they don't have the critical elements of their products already done. So getting a product up and running might be a milestone. One other milestone might be some kind of customer traction that may or may not be revenue, but maybe a couple of potential customers up there have played with your product or have used your product, and you've had some kind of success. That's a critical milestone. So getting to those milestones, you have to evaluate the time, and the resources, that some of the things that Cirque talked about. And based on those milestones, it's going to guide your expenses. So for example, if you're just kind of developing a product, you may not need a full-time CFO, you may not need certain hiring, administrative hiring. You just want to focus on your product development. So your hiring will be engineers or folks that will get your product out there. Then if your product is ready to go, your hiring might be in the marketing, sales and marketing space, and that will be your emphasis at that point. So giving those milestones and being able to assess the related cost in your model will help, number one, in figuring out how much money you need. Number two, it will focus your investors and will give you a lot more credibility from investors, because the one thing that investors really want is they want a rock star team, a team of entrepreneurs that know where they're going and have realistic goals. The number one turn off from investors is if they see a presentation, well, we need 15 million seed round, 30 million B round, and then we go IPO. That kind of pitch deck is probably going to get thrown in the trash. So milestone fundraising is key. So after you do that budgeting and you establish the milestones, the final point here is give yourself a buffer. There'll always be hiccups and bumps on the road. You will pivot. Things will be more expensive than you think. Things will take longer than you think. So giving yourself a 20 to 25% buffer is advisable, and will help you kind of achieve your goal. And it's something that investors expect at any rate. Next slide, please. So when you're creating those kind of milestones, you're going to need to really look at trade-offs. So you're going to have a budget. It's going to have a giant number that you need to raise. And then that's the time where you're going to have to get realistic with yourself. Milestone funding helps you kind of narrow that funnel a little bit more, but then figure out what kind of trade-offs that you'll need. There'll be certain marketing programs that you may not want to do because marketing is very, very expensive, and the effectiveness of marketing sometimes is kind of subjective. So until you have a little bit of experience, you might want to hold off on certain marketing budgets. Certain high-level hires, as I mentioned before, very early on, hiring a full-time CFO may not be the best thing, since you haven't really gotten an effective model yet, and you're still kind of wading through your business plan. So certain hiring trade-offs will definitely come in play. The second things are really focus what are the key expenditures that you need for each department to get you to those milestones that you've promised your investors. Early on, it could be product development resources, if you're a hardware company, engineering materials, and so on. Those are the key things that you may need initially, and then later on, when you have a little bit of traction, then sales and marketing becomes the departments where you're going to put a lot of your effort. Then finally is, the trade-offs of what can be done now as opposed to what can be done later. I think a lot of people go through and they feel that they have to have a perfect package corporation from the beginning. For example, significant investments in an office, or significant investments in certain marketing programs very, very early on. So, kind of prioritize where you should spend your money to get the biggest bang. That will help marshal your resources and also give you a lot of credibility in front of potential investors. So, the time frame that we talked about in your forecasting should be really no more than 3 years. I think savvy investors, that's what they look at. They look really 12 to 24 months is really the time frame that they're expecting. A lot of times the fundraising is guided within those time frames. What do you need for the next couple of years is really the questions that you'll be asked. So the investor expectations out there are for 3 years. So don't dilute yourself. Look at those time frames when figuring out how much to ask in your fundraising. Number two is that things will always change. Expect it and have the capability to pivot at strategic points. So having a constant look at your forecast, having a constant appraisal of where your company is will help you in marshaling your resources, using your cash effectively, but also planning how things are going to look like going within the next few months. So the investors don't really necessarily look negatively to companies that change or change based on assumptions. As a matter of fact, that's what they're investing in you for. I mean, entrepreneurs are expected to be creative and flexible and have the ability to turn on a dime. So don't be afraid to change when you think the time is needed. Forecasting, you have to understand your cash. You will get into trouble when you run out of cash. You will dilute yourself because if you have a very, very successful company and you're running out of cash, no matter, investors will see that and that will affect your evaluation. So understanding your cash burn and how much you'll need in the next raise is really, really critical, because you never want to get into a situation where, you're at a critical market point and you're out of cash and you either can't raise the money and you lose the market window, or you're raising the money at valuations that are that either upset your prior investors or upset you as an entrepreneur. So constant forecasting process and with the help of a really good financial advisor will help you avoid that pitfall.
Alec, can I just chime in here on that last point as well? Because we get a lot of questions about, from entrepreneurs who say, okay, help me kind of put together a plan to put together a financial plan, right? So, do I just look at cash? Do I look at cash spending? Because really at an early stage, that's all we really care about. Or do I look at more like an income statement, the way that, investors would want to see an income statement? And this is where, I think it kind of, a lot of it depends on the way that the entrepreneur thinks. A lot of entrepreneurs think strictly in terms of cash, but really we say that for any company that's going to ultimately go out to outside investors, we really want to put together a financial plan that looks at it the way that investors would look at it, right? So the way that investors look at it is they look at the P&L or the income statement. They look at the revenue, cost of goods sold, operating expenses, what do we make or lose in a given period. And that in itself does not tell us the entire picture, because there's a lot of things that happen that doesn't show up on the P&L that does impact cash. And so we need to be able to make adjustments for that. And so that's why we, strongly suggest a, 3 financial statement, the classic 3 financial statement way of reporting as a great template to use. So not only looking at the P&L, but what happens with the balance sheet. So for example, if you are a company that is going to be working with bigger companies and you're going to be sending them invoices, right? So you may sell a service in January, but you may not collect upon that until March, right? Well, that's going to have an impact on cash, obviously, that goes beyond what you're going to see on the P&L. And so being able to account for those kinds of things, the only true way of doing it is to look at the P&L, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement all together to show you what's really, really going on. And that's what we would recommend, although I know a lot of entrepreneurs really don't think in those types of terms. And so they tend to use a little bit more simplistic approach.
That's an excellent point. And one key example is really in SaaS companies. Part of being a SaaS company, per GAAP financial standards require you to recognize revenue over the subscription term. So say, for example, you're selling a $12,000 license for a year. You might get that $12,000 up front and that affects your cash, but the revenue is $1,000 a month in this example. showing a cash basis financial statement might be kind of the convenient way to go, but know that investors are savvy to that and want GAAP financials. So they want your P&L to be in GAAP standard, but they'll also look at your cash flow statement to see how your cash your operations are affecting burn over time. So, we're getting to the end here. The thing that you want to do is gather information, because history is going to be the best guide for your forecasting process in your business. What gathering good information or good metrics will do is will help you develop trends in the future. So analyze what's happening with your business. So having a good set of financials with related metrics as needed will really help you in the process, because not only will it help you in your forecasting, but it will help you communicate to potential investors as well. So looking at prior year numbers, having your financials incorporated into your forecast is really critical. I see a lot of companies that the entrepreneur is a very, very savvy MBA, and their financial model is completely separate from their income statement. One of the things that I always do is I tie my forecast to my financials. So I have the prior year actuals tied directly into my forecasting. So people could see trends, and we could see trends too in the forecasting, because a lot of times we get hung up on the big numbers, but we miss some items based on prior spending in the forecasting. So having that history is really key. So the other thing that you need to do is also look at your history and then figure out what changes are going to happen in the future. So initially you might be developing a product, there's a few of you around, and you may not need facilities, you may not need certain legal help, but at some point when your product is starting to get out there, that legal help for contracts might be a heavy consideration. Legal help for patents might be a consideration later on in your development. So look at how your business is going to change. And I think my final point on this one is get help from outside expertise. You may not be, a great financial modeler, but there are people out there that are, and in the whole scheme of things, they're relatively cheap given the whole amount that you're going to spend. So project these changes and get the needed help at the appropriate time. So the financial projections we've talked about top down. What the thing that I usually do is I use a top down financial projection for maybe year 2 or 3, and then I use a bottom up financial projection for year 1. So I always like to keep a bottom up projection going for 1 year, and I'd like to update that all the time. So say for example, now I'm forecasting for 2020. After the first quarter of 2020, I'm already forecasting for the first quarter of 2021. So I'm always looking at my forecast, bottom up forecast, at least 1 year. And if you have the time, really go ahead and do it for 2 years. But those are the methodology that I recommend to my clients. And not everybody's different, but that's I found that formula to be very successful. So mixing a combination of top down and bottom up in your financial projections really kind of shows maturity. And I think a lot of investors will see that, a bottom-up forecast 3 years down the road may not really hold, and may be kind of a waste of resources initially, just because things do change so rapidly in today's world.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ala. And actually, we've just got a couple minutes here left, before our allotted time. I do see that we have a few questions that have been asked on the chat. Maybe we just can just touch upon these really quickly. Ricardo has asked about being able to see this presentation again. I think Jerisa mentioned that we're going to actually be making this available. You're going to be receiving both the slide set as well as the recording via email within the next 48 hours. So you'll have this. And for anyone who's interested, you can, certainly go onto our YouTube page and you'll find it there, as well as other presentations that we have done. So please, feel free to do that. Anthony just asked the same exact question, so you can expect this, to be sent out to you. There are a couple of specific questions about, I think someone asked about, how do you estimate outsourced service costs, such as payroll, CFO, marketing. I don't know that there's going to be references out there, but what we really recommend for entrepreneurs is really to expand your network, meet other entrepreneurs. There's lots of, forums and gatherings, where like-minded entrepreneurs are gathering. And so that, you'll probably be able to get, good advice from those folks, especially people who have either been through, the similar stage that you're going through or similar industry. And so there's probably places to go there, and as well as just talk with experts that reach out to firms like Early Growth, talk to lawyers to figure out kind of what they charge and what level of effort that they're going to be going through. Payroll service providers tend to be very cheap. So yeah, there's just lots of resources. There isn't like any particular places that we recommend, but talking with people who've been through it is probably the best. And then maybe, Ola, maybe you could kind of touch upon this one last kind of, relatively detailed question from Curtis about e-commerce and about using, monthly growth as not being the best approach. What should we do?
Right. So in e-commerce, really the key thing that a lot of investors look at is that how do you drive activity to your site? So while growth rates might not be, something that investors want to look at on a kind of a high level basis, that you give your SOM as $100 million and say from that point on we're going to anticipate a monthly growth rate of 10%. Really, in e-commerce, a lot of investors want to say, okay, how are you going to get the traction to get eyeballs onto your site? To get folks to get folks interested, and then what are the metrics that you're using for conversion rates, and what is the underlying thought behind that? So while investors disapprove of just standard growth rates on a percentage basis, if you provide the proper foundation by saying, okay, here's who we're going to hit, here's how we're going to hit, we're anticipating, we've done a test marketing run and we got this much activity on our website. We think that if we grow our, marketing budget to, start a Facebook campaign or certain other campaigns, we could drive the activity up or eyeballs on our site by this percentage rate. And then if you have that as your foundation and then anticipate a growth rate from there, I think that's a lot more credible than just saying, here's my total market size that I'm going to enter with, and I'm assuming a 10% growth rate from that point. So that's really what we meant about what investors disapprove on growth rate. If you have a good foundation and a good explanation of what are going to be the critical drivers to your e-commerce site, that I think will go a long way to getting investor confidence.
Yeah, thanks, all. And I know we're already out of time, but I do want to touch upon one question that Ricardo asked about, whose responsibility is it to understand the cash? Is it the role of the CEO, or can it be the role of a CFO or COO? And the answer is yes to all of the above. As the CEO, as the founder, if there's two numbers that you need to have at the tip of your tongue at any moment of the day, any moment of the month, is how much cash do we have and what's our runway? Or in other words, how long does that cash last us? Those two things you absolutely have to know. Investors are going to expect you to know it. You should know it, obviously, from an operational standpoint. So yes, the CFO will know it. Yes, the COO will probably know it as well if you have one. But the CEO absolutely, absolutely needs to have this information and know the information.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ala and Sir. This was very informative. Thank you to everyone that participated today, asked questions, and once again, yes, this will be available to you in the next 48 hours. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. You can follow us, send us a question on one of our social media platforms. You can email us if you had additional questions or would like to speak to someone. And also, you can also find out about our upcoming webinars as well as live events. Thank you again, and we will see you for the next one.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.